Welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. This week, we try to understand what's really going on in the Middle East as Israel's ground offensive claims more Palestinian lives. Our guest is from the Pan-African University. And what led to the crash of the Malaysian flight MH17? Was it an honest mistake, or was the alleged missile fire deliberate on a passenger airplane with no stake in the Ukraine-Russia standoff? Then, how the French celebrate Bastille Day in Nigeria. Just like the Americans, it's a party, but in a more formal environment. The French love their wines and variety of cuisine. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. We'll be right back. Scores of people have been killed since Israel began its offensive on the Gaza Strip last week. However, more people have died since it launched its ground offensive. There are reports that as it's Sunday, 60 people had been killed in one area alone. And while Israel has had only one in number of death toll, since the offensive began, the number has gone up to 18, mostly soldiers. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised to continue operations in Gaza despite the growing number of fatalities.
3 days since it announced the ground offensive, Israel has kept true to its word. The growing number of casualties have been more on the part of the Palestinians, with only a quarter or so of the more than 400 people who've been killed since the offensive began on the part of Israel. Gaza's hospitals are overwhelmed with the dead and wounded coming in consistently. A health ministry official says medical supplies are running out and there is a shortage of medicine, particularly those needed to treat the wounded and perform emergency operations, and health teams have announced a red alert across all hospitals in the Gaza Strip, while officials have been urged to take responsibility. On Sunday alone, at least 50 Palestinians were killed in Israeli shelling on a Gaza neighborhood. With bodies strewn everywhere, thousands fled to a hospital for shelter, along with the wounded, which have numbered above 2,000 since Israel's offensive. Even worse is that ambulances cannot always reach victims because certain areas have been declared closed military zones. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has urged the UN Security Council to hold a session on Gaza, and on Sunday he declared 3 days of mourning after accusing Israel of carrying out a massacre in Shajaya neighborhood. He urged the international community to protect Palestinians. More than 60 Palestinians and 13 Israeli soldiers were killed as Israeli rocket fire hit Shajaya, and Sunday has been described as the bloodiest day since the start of the 13-day offensive. While Hamas has put no faith in Egypt's intervention in the crisis, it's developed a listening ear to Qatar. The militants have demanded that any agreement must include lifting a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt on the Gaza Strip and a return to an understanding that ended a previous round of fighting in 2012. The UN Security Council was scheduled to hold a meeting on Sunday night after the UN Relief and Works Agency revealed that 81,000 displaced people have taken refuge in 61 unwarranted shelters in Gaza. In faraway South America, the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has condemned the Israeli airstrikes as a policy of genocide that could not be justified as like-for-like warfare. He explains that Palestine does not have an armed forces, so it's not a fair war. In the rest of the world, there have been protests in favor of Gaza. And as thousands of Palestinians flee their homes for safety, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has promised to press on with Israeli campaign in the Hamas-controlled Gaza with the goal of restoring quiet while significantly damaging Hamas and other militant groups' infrastructure in Gaza.
My guest this week believes that the crisis in the Middle East, despite being a protrusion of centuries-old rivalry, has more of a biblical undertone than religious or political. Yes, Israelis had been predicted to split in the scriptures and come back in one piece after many, many years, but does it give them a right to fight this war? So is it possible that, all of the players in what's going on in the Middle East are probably, looking at this from the perspective of their own religious preferences, perhaps?
More or less, because if you look at it the way it was, after the dispersal of the Jews, naturally, the people that thought they were the owners of the place came back to the place, given the antecedents. The Israelites dislodged them, the Jews dislodged them when they came to the Promised Land. So, and dislodging them, they had sway for a considerable period of time, then they sinned. God said, look, I'm going to disperse you as a punishment, which happened, before the Roman occupation. But of course, this is from the Christian point of view. But the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. They didn't see it. Okay, they left. That's something they left. So when, after so many years, they had to come back, there were people occupying the place. The Palestinians were there, more or less moving back to where they thought was theirs. And this was a passage of many years. So when the Zionist movement started, to answer to the anti-Semitist movement in Europe and things like that, it was like, where should they go? Back to where they thought they belonged to. So in that sense, you're asking that, what about those who had been there, who probably did not share the religious issues about this? And that's the genesis of it, because when they came back, they had to dislodge the people that were there. Yeah, because from my understanding, Britain has been accused of being the mastermind of this centuries ago, because they promised Israel and they also promised Palestinians their own state in the same location. What really happened was that it was a politics of, let's put it like, extension of territorial powers. France, Britain, and some other powers, as it were interested in that Palestine area. Now, also with don't rule out US as well, because in that sense, US also was trying to, all of them are trying to escape the moral feeling that they had with the issue of how the Jews were treated in Europe and things like that. Then particularly for US, they didn't want, more or less, too much migration of these people into that place. So, like, let's give them a place there. Now, really, the British Prime Minister at that time, I'm trying to remember his name, had promised the Palestinians, I'm going to give you this place. Just support me against, these other incursions and things like that. But just that when the pressure became too much, and also the fact that they felt that Israelites were more of a possible ally than the Palestinians, they just naturally, give to them. And that was 1950s, the 1940s. That literally was a major blow to the psyche of the Palestinians, who thought the West were a bit of their friends and things like that. We're bringing it now to our own present time. How important is Gaza to both countries? Yeah, which countries are you talking about now? I'm talking about Israel and Palestine. How important is the Gaza Strip? Because that is where the offensive is taking place. Actually, Gaza Strip, let's put it this way, the whole of Palestine was like not so barren, not as barren in terms of land, but in terms of economic power. At least Palestinians who were there were actually economically powerless and things like that. So if you look at that landscape, it was Israel came in the middle. When they came, Israel was given land in the middle. Around that time, Egypt was controlling Gaza Strip. Egypt had a control of the Gaza Strip, which was closer to Egypt, and then the West Bank was on the other side, belonging to, I think, to Jordan or so. Now, because of the wars that they had, so many wars, and things like that, at a point in time, Egypt was saying, okay, take it back, let the Palestinians have it back. But because of the war that came up in 1967, what happened was that Israel just took over those places and conquered them. And even our next went as far as Sinai. So with benefit of time, okay, let's give it back to you. Let's move away from it. Let's give it. So it became like a point. It's only crossing, really. Gaza, as it were, is the closest, let's say, the borderline between Egypt and Palestine, and more so Israel.
So Israel has started a ground offensive on Gaza. The main target, of course, is the Hamas tunnels, which have a direct link from Palestine to Israel. They say they want to destroy those tunnels, which they can't do if they're on the air. But it seems more like, much of the casualties have been happening on the part of the Palestinians. It would seem more like Israel had a motive in this crisis.
Yeah, the motive is strong because, number one, let's take it back to the fact that what Hamas deploys, the rockets they deploy and things like that, and not usually just, of course there are some homemade rockets that, with cash flush from Iran and things like that, they're able to manufacture their own. But basically, for the long-range missiles, they are coming from Iran, So, but one thing that, there are two ostensible issues or axe to grind that Israel is deploying. Number one, they want to decimate the power of Hamas in terms of, your rocket launches. And number two, to also tell Iran that we are not as docile as you think.
If I'm understanding what you're saying, it sounds like what's going on between Israel and Palestine has been building up over time. It's been building up over time. And more importantly, is the fact that this crisis could have been avoided.
Yeah, it could have been, but it can't be avoided. It could be, but it can't.
So that means that the abduction and the killing of those 3 Israelis and then the Palestinian boy in Gaza could have, were just triggers.
Yeah, one thing about this abduction that one has to be very careful about, because there are even worse militant organizations in Palestine than Hamas. Worse. But everything is labeled as coming directly or indirectly from Hamas. So even that kidnapping might not have been carried out by Hamas or anybody related to Hamas. But as far as Israel is concerned, there's need, because Hamas is like the ringleader. Probably some people are even saying, look, Hamas, you're not as bloody as you want it to be. So that Israel is seeing that Hamas is the principal factor that is driving the violence in that area. And that's why when Fatah and Hamas, came together early this year, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, look, we're not going to accept that. We are going to ask why would we not accept it? Palestinians are coming to our terms today. No, we're not going to accept that because Hamas is like the springboard for many other militant forces who are even stronger than Hamas, as it were. So really that abduction might not have been Hamas incited, but Israel needed to show some.
But someone had to take responsibility for those 3 teenagers that were killed and abducted and killed. Someone had to take responsibility for them. And I'm going to take you up on what you said about Israel, rejecting the Hamas-Fatah collaboration, because Israel did voice out concerns back then. Were their concerns legitimate?
Let me put it that way. In the context of the hostilities that they're surrounded with, you will say it is legitimate. In the context of the fact that they need to preserve, you see, let's put it this way, it's strategic. If that land, they are not saying really that the land is ours, It's just that we have occupied it, we have taken those lands up, and we find that they are strategic for us. They help us, they help our security more. So why would we cede it to you? Rather than cede it to you, we'll put structures there. So, in some sense, when you look at that, you see that the strategy for Israel is preservation, more or less. It's not as if it's, it's anything more than preservation. The pragmatism of, preservation. We don't want to expose ourselves to, if you remember in 2005 when I think it was Yitzhak Rabin that ceded that left the Gaza Strip and gave it back to the Palestinians. Netanyahu resigned from the government because he said, look, this is not good enough. If we move away from here, it's not for anything else. We're going to empower the Hamas, who would now become in control. And in 2006, what happened? Hamas won the election. And they become emboldened. So it's not as if it's just strategy of preservation. We can't, but...
I'm interested in what the international community has to do here, because apart from Egypt, there's made a proposal for a ceasefire, which Hamas, of course, rejected. And the United Nations has been also calling for a ceasefire. We haven't really seen much international intervention into the crisis. Is this because it is too complicated for them to handle?
And not because it's too complicated, but because, let me put it this way, Israel had always been the obstinate party, more or less, and also the Hamas too, because nobody wants to shift ground. So there are so many resolutions have been passed by United Nations in the past, but what did it become? So many 1-to-1, so many resolutions. So at the point in time, it's coming like, what do we do? What else? Short of going to the war ourselves. And remember, there is, let's say the cascading effect of any intervention that is not literally for, going to speak well, because as United Nations, you are saying that you're neutral. So you can only condemn, you can only say, don't do this, this is not right. And because also for Egypt, it's natural that they will reject because we're talking about...
No, Egypt made the proposal. Hamas rejected it.
They will reject it. Because Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood, that was ruling in Egypt as of last year, they are more or less 5 and 6. So